Good morning, ladies. Here we are almost at the end of this class. So this week you have a reading task due, the last one. Next week you have a discussion due, the last one. And then the week after that you take the final. So we're really in the home stretch. This week you're reading chapter 23 and 24. And you'll do a reading task where you get to kind of apply some of what you read in the reading task. Chapter 23 is basically about the history of Christianity in the United States, and it starts with some of the different missionary groups that came to the U.S. So the first group were basically Spanish Catholics, and they basically came from the South and moved up across the whole kind of base of the United States of America, with St. Augustine, Florida, as its first place. And basically what you see happening with the missionaries is that they kind of follow the explorers. They kind of have a twofold sort of goal. The people who are coming into America, they want to take over land, conquer land, but they also want to spread their religion. And so you have Catholic Spaniards coming up from the south. And then after the Spanish, there are the French who basically come from the north and move down. And those are also usually Catholic missionary people, and they, again, are spreading Catholicism. So eventually when the English make it to America, even though they kind of conquer the land and impose their kind of democracy or government, they also bring over more Protestant denominations of Christianity. And so at this point in time, native indigenous people would have been exposed to Catholicism, but Protestantism was kind of new to them. And so when the French came, they were basically trying to set up trade routes. So they had a little bit more of a congenial relationship with the indigenous people. And then, of course, the English had their own kind of relationship. And it kind of varied depending on which specific group of people we're talking about. America, as you know, was founded on kind of religious freedom, but basically people that were sort of outcasts in other countries came over here and tried to set up their own little religious colonies in the origin of America. And so there were really three different kinds of people who came from the east. This would be with the English colonization. And the first were traditional Christians, which would have been more like the Anglican Church or Episcopalian Church. And they first came and kind of set up different colonies here. And then there was more of the Calvinist religions who came and they set up different little colonies. And in their colonies, they practiced what's called theocracy, which was kind of a combination of government and religion. They were kind of one thing instead of two. There was basically no separation of church and state. And so all of the rules in these colonies were kind of dictated by religious views and their idea of morality. And then there were some colonies that were set up with sort of total religious freedom. And so there was a real tolerance of other religions and other practices. Of course, one thing that had a great influence on Christianity was Enlightenment, and we talked about that in the last unit. But one thing that was sort of a reaction to the Enlightenment movement was called the Great Awakening. And this was kind of a religious revival. And so this meant that there were all these preachers who basically traveled around in the U.S. and preached. They would set up little revivals and really tie into people's natural guilt over their sinfulness and try to help them kind of reject what Enlightenment told them and try to move back toward their faith. The goal of the Great Awakening was for unity, but it really created a lot more division. And this led to denominationalism, meaning people kind of figuring out which denomination or which brand of Christianity they really believed in and trying to follow that to the best of their ability. And it really did mean that they sort of allowed other people to do the same, but didn't really involve themselves with those other denominations, tried to stay within their denomination. There were a couple of great awakenings, but the second one kind of led to more of a literalist approach and a real sort of evangelical approach, or sort of this idea that you want to spread your religion in a more not offensive, but being on the offense, like going door to door and really telling people about your faith. And two of those religions that developed at that time were the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses, which we still have kind of that perception anyway that they're very much into evangelizing and going door to door and spreading their religion that way. And they were real concerned with the end of the world and the end times and trying to predict when that might happen. So again, this really did lead to a lot of disunity or a lot of divisions among Christian people where they really kind of banded together with the people of their own denomination. The theocratic colonies, though, the ones that practiced the theocracy that I talked about, they had the hardest time accepting people of other faiths, and this led to a lot of discrimination, especially when Catholic people started to come from Ireland and other places. Ireland was the big one. And they also held a lot of discriminatory beliefs about Jewish people. And so those two groups really had a hard time in the early years of Christianity. One thing on a positive note that was good is that all of the Christian churches really believed that they should spread God's love, and so volunteerism was a big thing. And this kind of led to more activism, volunteerism did. And so this really brought up a lot of questions about, as Christians, how much should we be involved in society and the secular world? And do we speak out against injustices? And if we do, how do we choose which injustices are immoral and which ones are morally acceptable? So the different denominations didn't necessarily see eye to eye about that. So chapter 23 will go into more detail about slavery, women's rights, and the rights of the worker, and how the different denominations treated those issues. In chapter 24, we're talking more about modernity, or the more contemporary situation. And how does this church kind of relate itself to the contemporary world? And when I say this church, I'm really talking about a lot of churches, but chapter 24 does focus a lot on Catholicism. And so one big thing that happened was Vatican II. Vatican II was called for by Pope John the 23rd, who's now a saint. And when he called for Vatican II, he said that we need to open the windows and let in some fresh air. So one of the goals of Vatican II was really to bring the church into the modern world. And that was pretty radical at the time. People did not expect this from Pope John the 23rd. He was kind of older, and they expected him just to keep the status quo. So he surprised everyone when he called for Vatican II. And he actually didn't live long enough to see Vatican II to its full fruition. So he called for it. It started in 1962. He died in 1963. Pope Paul VI was the pope who kind of continued his work and finalized Vatican II. And there were a lot of changes that came out of Vatican II, and I won't talk about many of them, but the book goes into detail about them. Some of the changes happened with the liturgy. This was kind of a big deal and made a big impact on the people at the time. Some of the changes came with our relationship with other Christian churches and with other faiths, like the Jewish faith and Islam. And one big document that you'll read about is called Nostra Aetate. And this document really did kind of open the doors to recognize the religious truth and value of other religions, encourage Catholics to look into those other religions, and try to form more of a loving relationship with those groups. Another document that you'll read about was called Gaudium et Spes, and this is basically encouraging us as Christians to get involved and be active in the modern world and to help influence the modern world, to be kind of God's hands and feet in the world. A third one that's written about is called De Verbum. This is all about Scripture and its relationship in the world. As you know from our discussion prior to this, the Protestant Reformation really called into question what we call tradition with a capital T. And this De Verbum kind of reinforces the Catholic belief that Scripture and tradition hold equal weight. The Bible is very important and should be very important to us as Catholics, but so should how God has revealed himself through history, through the work of the bishops and the popes in the tradition of the church, informing the kind of rules, guidelines, discussion points of the Catholic faith. And as far as the document De Verbum, it also encouraged Catholics to use modern forms of biblical criticism. This wasn't the first document to say that. Actually, Pope Pius XII wrote something called Divino Flaunte Spiritu, which also in 1943 encouraged people to use modern forms of biblical interpretation. Finally, there's lots of other contemporary movements that are discussed. In this chapter, it will talk about science and theology and how those two kind of play with each other. It will talk about the historical Jesus. Pay special attention to Catholic social teaching, because that's what your homework assignment is this week, is to pick one of those topics and find an example of that today and reference one of these encyclicals, which are the documents from Vatican II. I mean, there are encyclicals from all throughout church history, but primarily Vatican II, to kind of comment on that topic today. You'll read about feminism and feminist theology, liberation theology and black theology, and all the nuances of all those different theologies in the modern world. So good luck with the homework this week and the reading. Have a great week.